to the Belief Books Podcast, Episode 1. I'm Josh Naiman, and I'm on a mission. That mission is to explore our beliefs. I'll be interviewing people to talk about what they believe and why on a variety of topics. And I'm starting more conversations to simply talk about our beliefs. As of this recording, I've interviewed 13 guests for the podcast. Most of them for this chapter, Chapter 1, which I've named Denial, because it's about climate change denial. 2 guests have talked to me about science and faith for Chapter 2, Duality. And I've met with 1 guest for Chapter 3, Revision, where I'll be talking to anyone from pastors and priests to my friends who have either left their faith after believing or didn't have faith and then found it. Essentially, they have revised their thinking one way or the other. From these conversations, I am creating podcasts, videos, and actual books, as well as articles on the website, thebeliefbooks.com. And every year, I'll organize all the content I've documented for that year and design a book out of it. And each year will be a new volume of the Belief Books series. So that's my idea in a nutshell.
We are in danger of degrading the life support system of the only planet that we know of in the universe that supports complex life. This is a big deal, and we're only going to get one shot at this, and that shot is happening right now.
Climate change is a huge topic. Huge because it's complex. Huge because it's something that affects each and every one of us, and future us. So that's the reason why I decided to start this series here. My first guest, Peter Sinclair, has a ton of experience with the topic of climate change and even debating deniers. So he's able to do a great job of taking us through a whole lot of different aspects of climate change, and specifically about his experience and knowledge when it comes to denial. This past April, I took a road trip up to Traverse City, Michigan. I'm in Indianapolis, by the way. And I scheduled a 2-day tour to meet with 4 experts from all different fields, all relating in some way to climate change. A cherry grower, a former meteorologist, a horticulture researcher, and a citizens' climate lobby volunteer. Plus, I got the green light to document a Citizens Climate Lobby panel event that happened to be the very same night I was in town. You'll meet those guests and hear more about that awesome trip in the upcoming episodes of the Belief Books. So, one of the other guests, Dave Behrens, the former meteorologist, told me that I had to interview this guy from Michigan who is apparently well known in the realm of climate change and debating deniers specifically. In the short amount of time I had to spare before meeting with him, I was able to look Peter up, and Dave was not kidding. This guy is arguably one of the internet's leading climate video bloggers with over 16,000 subscribers, 100 videos, and 2.5 million total views on his work, and probably more than that now, depending on when you're listening to this. So I called him, and I explained my vision for the Belief Books, and I must not have scared him too much because he invited me to his home in Midland, Michigan, to do the interview. So that's where this conversation took place. Peter Sinclair is a climate educator, videographer, and has been an active voice for climate change for many years now. He travels to Greenland regularly to document the effects of climate change there, works on the Dark Snow Project and This Is Not Cool with Yale. But he is probably best known for his Climate Crock of the Week series, which is where episode 1 begins.
Most people know me from the video series Climate Denial Crock of the Week, and that was basically kind of just a out of the blue inspiration. I was at a sort of a low point. I had gone to, as I said, a training with Al Gore, and I was giving workshops around the area. And I was finding that the material that I got from Gore people was good, but it wasn't meeting all of my needs. And because I was a graphic artist, I started creating more of my own. And also, if I created my own, I didn't have any restrictions like copyright restrictions or anything like that. So pretty soon I had a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation that was mostly mine. And I was adding in little wrinkles like animations and this and that. And it wasn't that much of a skip to start robbing a little bit of extra B-roll material from YouTube and cutting it all together and doing a voiceover and creating a video. And those first few videos are pretty rough.
Here's the average for the period 1979 to 2000. You can see the extent shrinks in the summer and goes back up in the winter. Look at the difference in the extent of 2007 ice. And here's up to the end of 2008. So don't cheat yourself by going to secondary sources of information. Do yourself a favor and seek out the real data. These professionals do a good job of putting it in a form that ordinary, intelligent people can understand. And I want to thank you for all your support on this series. I hope you'll keep coming back and tell your denier friends. They don't have to live on the dark side. Just check out Climate Denial Crock of the Week and help us get the word out on the most critical problem of our time.
I probably made a mistake calling it Climate Denial Crock of the Week, which sort of meant that I had to keep putting one out every week. And let me explain what the climate crocks are. The climate crocks is what I call these crunchy little nuggets of disinformation that are specifically crafted in think tanks in Washington and New York and Chicago by people with PR and advertising backgrounds to be something that Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or Donald Trump can say in 15 seconds.
So Obama's talking about all of this with the global warming and that, and a lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry, okay? It's a hoax.
But it takes a good climate scientist maybe an hour to completely unpack it with accuracy. That is the challenge that the climate scientists have, is that they want to be accurate and they want to get it right. But it's very easy, and these techniques were pioneered by the lead industry and the asbestos industry and the tobacco industry in particular, ways of like diverting an argument or throwing people off the track or distorting or confusing.
Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive, yes.
Mr. Johnston.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no.
So my idea was to go directly at those. There's only about a couple dozen of them, and they keep recycling them. So sometimes you have to shoot down more or less the same crock in its various incarnations and variants, and we're still doing that to a degree today. But now we've pretty much gotten past the point of people saying that climate change is not happening, or that the world is not warming, or that it's cooling, or something like that, because that's simply not congruent with the experience, the actual experience that a large part of the population has. Anybody that's older than 35 or 40 knows that things are different than they were when they were small. And particularly, I'm over 60 now, so things are really different, and this is a common experience over the whole world. So it's really, you make yourself ridiculous if you say the climate's not changing. So the newest argument that we're getting, particularly in the current administration, is, well, yes, the climate is changing, but doesn't the climate always change? And maybe it's not people, or maybe we don't know how to really predict how it's going to change, or maybe it won't be so bad. So this is, they keep backpedaling, but the goal is to, on behalf of their clients, to make sure that we don't move to the renewable energy solutions, the non-carbon energy solutions, for as long as possible, because there are literally trillions of dollars online. And so these, it's a relatively small group of people, and the same faces keep showing up on television, at congressional hearings, again and again and again, and more or less recycling the same nonsense arguments. But because there's a tremendous amount of financial incentive for them to keep doing it, they're going to keep coming back as long as they are rewarded. And to be fair, this is a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people. Most people have been not paying very close attention to the news, and they don't pay close attention to science. We're very poorly educated in science as a rule in this country. And so it's relatively easy for the average, say, Fox News viewer who maybe only hears one item on climate science every 6 months. If that's a distortion, then they just go back to their everyday life and say, well, okay, I don't have to worry about that because that's all nonsense. So in the long haul, we're winning. People are getting it, and just about all the polling, and I know several high-level pollsters, both at Yale and other universities like George Mason University, that specialize in looking at climate change, knowledge, awareness, and attitudes. And without a doubt, the majority of people get it, that climate is changing. The majority of people get it, that human beings have something to do with it. And a solid majority of people favor regulating greenhouse gases and promotion and research into renewable non-carbon sources of energy. So we've kind of crossed a big barrier in terms of public awareness and acceptance after a whole lot of work. But the question now is, how fast can we bring those solutions online? Because climate change is coming on in many respects faster and harder than what many people would have predicted even 15 or 20 years ago. And one example, for instance, that I give is in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is the international body that has been coming out with these massive reports every 5 or 6 years for the last 25 years with everything that we know about climate change. And in their report as recently as the year 2000 or 2001, they predicted that we would see no loss of ice from the ice sheets of Antarctica in this century, before 2100. And they predicted that losses from Greenland would be minor, or that perhaps that we might even see those ice sheets gain mass. This is what their report said just 16, 17 years ago. But now, because we have much more accurate measurements, we have a lot more people working on it, we have the so-called GRACE satellites, which are the gold standard as far as measuring the mass of those ice sheets. We know that both of those ice sheets are losing mass, and a lot of it at an accelerating pace. And that is going to impact us on sea level rise much harder and much sooner than most people imagine. In fact, one of the points that I make to people is that this is not a problem for the far future. This is not a problem for our grandchildren. This is something that's impacting us right now. I tell audiences, you're already paying money. It's already costing you money to deal with climate change. I was in Miami Beach, which is really ground zero in the United States for sea level rise impacts. It's very low, obviously. You're right on the beach. And South Florida sits on essentially a coral reef, which means it's like a giant stone sponge. And so there's no stopping the water as it rises. And when you have a high tide, the water literally comes bubbling up through the ground, through the sewer system. It's unstoppable. There's no wall you can build to keep it out. And I was right in the middle of the ritziest, most high-rent district of Miami Beach, just 100 yards off the boardwalk on Collins Avenue, shooting pictures of water that was sloshing up over the curbs at high tide in October. October is when they get the highest king tide events. People are, they're aware of it. They're working with it the best they can. They're actually spending $400 million on a pumping system for Miami Beach alone, which is designed just to simply try to pump the water off of Miami Beach as fast as it is bubbling up. And this is obviously a solution that is a Band-Aid. It's a $400 million Band-Aid, but it is not going to obviously be the answer for the future. And so it's clear to anybody that's paying attention that South Florida as we know it, just with the sea level rise that's already in the pipeline, South Florida is pretty much doomed. It's not going to be 50 years from now what we think of as South Florida today. And this is a massive tragedy.
Mr. Mayor, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Miami Beach, Tucker.
Miami Beach. Oh, did I say Palm Beach?
You said Palm Beach, and I love Palm Beach, but Miami Beach is where it's at.
I have Mar-a-Lago on the mind. Excuse me. So,
you mean that new water park in the future?
So look, you're concerned about rising sea levels. I'm not here to argue that's not a concern, or the details of climate science, because I'm agnostic about it. I'm just wondering how this specific agreement, sending $3 billion a year to countries like India and China, who don't have to lower their emissions rates, is going to fix the global warming problem in Miami Beach.
Tucker, let me tell you what's going on in Miami Beach. When I became mayor, we have streets that are flooding during sunny days. The water levels have gone up dramatically. We, of course, moved forward to raise our roads, put in pumps, change our building codes. And it's not because we're so excited to have to do that, but we have to do it for survival of our city. And it's not just Miami Beach. It's coastal cities all over the world.
Okay.
Hey, Tucker, I heard what you had to say, but I got to tell you something. When the world's leading scientists are telling you this is what's going on, I mean, and some of the smartest minds in the world are telling you this is the reason why, at some point you have to listen.
And we're seeing similar stories pretty much all the way up and down the East Coast and the Gulf Coast of the United States. Some areas more, some areas less. But then I also tell people here in the Midwest when I give my talks, don't think that because you're far away from the ocean that you aren't impacted. Because what we're seeing here is an absolutely accurately, reliably measured increase in extreme precipitation events, which are affecting us every month, every year. In Michigan, one of my favorite headlines of the last 6 months in the Detroit Free Press was, "Why do our freeways keep flooding?" They had just had an enormous storm event in the Detroit area that essentially shut down the freeways for several days, because these are freeways that were built in the 1950s, primarily, 50, 60 years ago, and essentially built for the weather conditions of a different planet. And we have warmed the atmosphere, and Physics 101 tells us that warmer air holds more moisture. So there's more moisture floating around out there. And when there is a storm event, it means that's more moisture, that is more energy for the storm. So everywhere on the planet, we are seeing more intense precipitation events, both rain and sometimes snow events, because there's simply more moisture, more energy for these storms to draw on. So in places like Detroit, people are faced with the prospect of either spending some money to harden your infrastructure and upgrade your infrastructure so that you're not going to be shut down by these storms on a regular basis. Or you're just going to have to accept it that you're going to lose a certain amount of productive time every year to weather events that you didn't 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. So these are real costs, and these costs are not small. They're massive, and they can only be addressed by really determined public response in terms of upgrading infrastructure. Another example would be water systems, storm systems. Every time we have one of these massive storms in a city like Detroit, sewage overflows, and we get a massive outflow of raw sewage into, for instance, the Detroit River, which flows into northern Lake Erie, where there are algae blooms in response to that influx of nutrients. And we now have algae in the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Erie, which didn't live there 50 years ago because it was too cold, but survives there now. And many of these algae are toxic algae. So you may remember 3 or 4 years ago, the water system of Toledo, Ohio had to be shut down. 500,000 people with no water because they had detected levels of this toxic algae, which produces a neurotoxin, which will kill you. And they simply had to shut down their water system until they had flushed everything out and cleaned it and waited for this algae bloom to subside. So that's another. It's not completely solely caused by climate change, but it is amplified by climate change. There are also agricultural causes, and there's other pollution sources as well. But climate change is making a whole lot of environmental problems markedly worse than they would otherwise be.
We could spend hours just naming all of the different repercussions of it. And this was being talked about maybe 20, 30 years ago, like, hey, something's happening, right? The data was starting to show that something was happening. What's the thing that's holding us back? Because there's so much. You would think that the people who are in the energy business see that potential of, oh, we could shift to this, and it's like free kind of, or there's easier sources. We just need to transition. How could they not capitalize on that and address the problem? What's the holdback?
Well, this is a very interesting story because, in fact, we know from internal documents at Exxon Oil Company, ExxonMobil, and Shell that they were having discussions way back in the 1970s and early 1980s about climate change because they hire good scientists. You know, they're massive companies. They attract some of the best, brightest people, and they knew from just the basic scientific literature was telling us that if we keep adding these greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, that are heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, that we're going to have a problem. And there was enough research in the 1970s that top-level Exxon scientists were briefing their board of directors and telling them, look, this is going to be a problem in the future. It's going to be potentially catastrophic. It's going to lead to sea level rise. It's going to lead to agricultural pressure. It's going to be particularly rough on people in the third world, people with fewer resources. And for some reason, the big oil companies decided not to act on that knowledge. In fact, they decided to begin in earnest to fund some of these very organizations that have been distorting and obfuscating and covering up what scientists know. And this is something that we've just learned in the last few years. It's maybe one of the greatest corporate crimes in history when all is said and done. It's absolutely tragic because the original theoretical underpinning of climate science as we know it comes from Joseph Fourier in France 200 years ago. And then the mechanism itself was physically demonstrated in London in 1859. And the calculations of what this might mean for the future, the first calculations in detail that were very much like our calculations today were done in the early 1900s. And then we further aced our knowledge of the radiative properties of greenhouse gases in the 1950s when we built our first generation of heat-seeking missiles. Because heat-seeking missiles have to know how the atmospheric gases process heat. Otherwise, they can't find their target. And those missiles do find their target. So we know that our understanding of atmospheric gases and their radiative properties is accurate. And once we had those accurate values, then scientists could begin to confidently make predictions about what we would see, even decades before we actually saw measurable effects. So it's very instructive to go back and look at some of the archival video of high-level scientists like Mike McCracken back in the early 1980s, like people at the National Weather Service. James Hansen was doing his research for NASA way back in the early 1980s. These people were making predictions. And, you know, this is one of the gold standards of science. If you think you know something, the real proof of it is, can you make a prediction? And they were making predictions. Of course, the most obvious prediction is it's going to get warmer. You know, if you're putting out more heat-trapping gases trap heat. More heat-trapping gases trap more heat, and heat makes things warmer. That's a bonehead prediction that you can make. But a whole raft of other predictions that come from basic physics 101, first-order physics, that, for instance, we would see the lower atmosphere, the troposphere, would warm, but the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, would cool. We now observe that. We would see the Arctic warm much faster than the temperate zone. We now observe that. We would see the northern hemisphere warm faster than the southern hemisphere. Now we observe that. They made predictions that were not only generalized in terms of the planet getting warmer, but in detail of what the configuration of that warming, the character of that warming would be. And so, although we continue to be surprised by some of the details of what we're seeing, and mostly surprised in the direction that things are happening faster than we imagined, the general outlines were pretty much understood way back in the 70s and early 80s.
It seems like the trouble is that if I am a normal guy in the world, and I'm not a scientist, how can I possibly wade through all this information? How does one start to find the truth?
It's interesting, it's strange. I mean, we don't anymore, nobody says, well, how do you know cigarettes are bad for you? Have you really looked into that science? You know, or do you really know that HIV causes AIDS? Are you sure of that? You know, have you done the research? You know, nobody asks you those kind of questions because those are so overwhelmingly well understood that it just simply, it doesn't occur to people. You would never see a panel on a news show and here's somebody that says that cigarettes are good for you. Here's somebody that says HIV does not cause AIDS. You would never see that, and yet that's common practice in climate science, and climate science is at least as well understood as those other issues. You know, it is completely understood. So the reason is because there's such a tremendous motivation for oil companies based on the fact that they own or have rights to tremendous amounts of carbon fuels that are still in the ground.
Early this morning, we heard ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson talk about the BP drilling disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. He also talked in our interview about balancing the risk and reward of oil exploration.
In terms of drilling, whether it's Alaska or offshore or wherever it might be, is your philosophy drill, baby, drill?
No, my philosophy is to make money. And so if I can drill and make money, then that's what I want to do.
And for a company like ExxonMobil, a large part of their evaluation in the market is based on that ownership that they have with the expectation that they're eventually going to be able to access all that oil, gas, and coal. And the science tells us that there's no way we can take all of the fossil fuels that are available out of the ground and pump them up into the atmosphere and still maintain a livable planet. So their motivation, even though they know that we are inevitably going to have to stop burning fossil fuels and we are inevitably going to go to non-carbon energy sources, for those managers that are simply looking to make a profit or show a profit in the next quarter, the overwhelming motivation is for them to keep stoking this denial machine and keep feeding those politicians who are part of that machine and who kind of push back against the development of renewables, against solutions, and against any kind of regulation or taxation on the burning of fossil fuels. Because the rewards are literally trillions of dollars, even hundreds of billions of dollars, even by the month. So it's absolutely staggering amounts of money that these people are motivated by. And in fact, I don't think it's any secret that we've got a problem with our relationship with Russia right now. Russia is a petrostate. Russia is a gigantic country with an economy smaller than Italy, and it is overwhelmingly reliant on fossil fuels. And the gang of mafia oligarchs who run that country, and there's really no other way to describe it, are very much aware that their wealth derives from their being able to skim from this flow of fossil fuel money that is coming out of their gas, their oil, and their coal. And I believe, and I don't think I'm alone, it is a big part of this climate denial pushback and the political conundrum that we find ourselves in right now derives from very, very determined motivation on the part of Russian oligarchy to maintain their power, maintain their wealth, and maintain their production of fossil fuels.
Wouldn't someone say, who was in defense of that, well, no, actually, how do you think we're going to change this whole system which runs on fossil fuels? So we need to keep feeding this machine because we have no other choice.
Well, it's very much like if you look back 25 or 30 years, the most powerful, or some of the most powerful and prosperous companies in the United States were the phone companies. AT&T was an absolutely huge company. It was based on landline telephones. And a few of those companies got it that this new cell phone technology was going to be a big thing, and they started getting ready for that transition. A few of those companies said, no, the cell phone thing, it's kind of a fad. It's always going to be sort of a side thing, and the landline phones are always going to be the major source of our income. Well, those companies aren't with us anymore. They're gone. And that is an example of technological change that we've seen several times now in our lifetime, especially, watching the advent of the internet. And as an improved technology comes in, at a certain point, it just reaches a critical mass where the price is right, and it's just so compelling that everyone has to move in that direction. And we're now at that point with renewable energy.
When President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord last week, California Governor Jerry Brown saw an opportunity to go green in China. Ben Tracy reports from Beijing.
This is serious stuff. This is not a game. This is not appealing to your political base. This is dealing with the existential threats to humanity.
California Governor Jerry Brown may now have more in common with the Chinese government than he does with the United States government. In a setting normally reserved for visiting heads of state, he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, who is now viewed as the world's leader on climate change.
China is the world's biggest polluter. Do you trust them to lead the world on this issue?
Well, they're taking the climate threat serious, so I say all to the good, and California will collaborate, and I just hope that Washington comes on board sooner rather than later.
Brown is not waiting. He came here to spur more Chinese investment in renewable energy, such as solar panels and wind turbines, which will help California achieve its own ambitious clean energy goals.
Renewable energy is now, in many parts of the world, the cheapest, most economical source of electric power. Solar energy is now producing, in some places of the world, it's producing energy at a price that no fossil fuel or nuclear or any other kind of fuel can match. Wind energy is very much the same. So what we used to think of as sort of exotic technology that was driven by public investment or subsidy has now become kind of the leading edge of a market-based change that is happening. So in places like Germany, some of the big utility companies are starting to get into trouble because they can no longer compete with the wind and solar in the volumes that are now pouring onto their electric grid. And this is starting to happen now in the United States. So we hope that this will continue. I don't think it's any question really that this is going to continue, because everything we know about the history of technology suggests that just like computer hard drives or computer chips, processing chips, that these prices are going to continue to drop. A lot of the technology derives from some of the same physics as the computer industry. And so we expect that these forms of energy are going to continue to become cheaper. And what I am telling people is, if we don't, as a society, tell our business community, particularly, for instance, our electric utilities, who serve at our pleasure because they are monopolies, they are regulated monopolies, that they better get ready for these changes. They better stop resisting these changes. They better make it easier for their customers, for instance, to use solar energy rather than harder. Because at a certain point, the technology will just overwhelm them. It will simply become so cheap and so efficient and so attractive, especially first to their larger business customers, but then all the way down the line to the residential customers, who will just begin to drop off the grid. And when that happens, those companies will go into death spirals. And if there's one thing we don't want here in Michigan or anywhere in the Midwest, is to see any more of our big companies go into death spirals. We don't want that, you know. These are massive collections of expertise and knowledge. They know how to run an electric grid. They know how to move energy around. And they should be applying themselves to facilitating this process, where instead of a few large power plants that direct their energy out to, like a hub and spoke, you know, directing their energy out to all of us customers, it's going to be something that looks a lot more like the internet, with thousands and thousands of energy producers, you know, small businesses, farmers, individuals. Anybody with a parking lot or a spare farmer's field is going to potentially be able to go into the energy business. And what we'd like is to then be able to bring that energy on to the grid, bring it on at a decent price, make sure everybody gets paid at an appropriate rate, and encourage that so that we can move much more quickly from the fossil fuel-based industries that we have to something that's going to be non-carbon. So that's the big question of the next 25 or 30 years. We can do it. You know, people have modeled it out, and even with today's technology, no need for any new breakthroughs or anything. We can go there in a relatively short time. But do we have the political will to make it happen? That's the question.
Since Peter mentioned that we have to have the political will to make a change, I feel like it was the perfect time to mention Citizens Climate Lobby again. But I'll explain it this time. So, Citizens Climate Lobby is an international grassroots environmental group that trains and supports its volunteers to build up relationships with their elected representatives in order to influence climate policy. They're empowering citizens to connect with and influence their members of Congress, and they spread the idea that each one of us truly can address climate change. For episode 2 of the Belief Books, I talked to Dory Chandler, who is the lead for the Indianapolis chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. We talk about science and faith, which isn't on the topic of climate change, but in that episode, she explains how that all connects with her environmental activism. So I suggest you listen to that conversation after you're finished listening to this episode. But in the meantime, you can find out more information about Citizens Climate Lobby by going to citizensclimatelobby.org. We pick our conversation back up where Peter gets into the role of the new U.S. administration and how that's playing in this climate change game. He talks about Russia too, but he also mentions a hopeful note about the resistance to all that's happening.
I heard that more people didn't vote than voted.
That's probably true, and we'll sort out exactly what happened in this election over the next couple of years, and I think it's going to be really interesting. But what I'm telling people is, look, you've got probably the absolutely worst collection of ideologues and miscreants and criminals being let loose in Washington that we've ever seen, and many, if not most of them, are part of this sort of fossil fuel, old guard establishment, and they are hell-bent on dismantling environmental regulations. We're already seeing this. But it's not as easy, and just because they say they're going to do it, you know. For instance, just today we read that the new head of the Environmental Protection Agency, Scott Pruitt, who has made it clear he is a climate denier. He is a huge proponent of fossil fuels, and he has been asked or expected that he would try to overturn the Supreme Court's finding on greenhouse gases, which basically, I think it was in 2009, the Supreme Court found that greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, were in fact a pollutant, and as a pollutant they have to be, by law, regulated by the EPA. So this is kind of a big deal. So people were hoping that with a new crowd in, that they would start to pursue legal actions that would try to overturn that Supreme Court finding. But even Mr. Pruitt has now let it be known that, and he's an attorney general, so he's got a legal mind, he understands that that ruling is so solid and so firmly based in science and legal precedent that it would be an absolute waste of time for him to try to overturn it. And it would just reduce his credibility for any other kind of legal initiatives that he would want to pursue. So it would appear that, at least for now, the EPA, even under this new management, is not going to try to knock the legs out of our regulation of greenhouse gases. Simply because it's just, remember when President Trump said nobody knew that healthcare was complicated. Well, there's a lot of other things about governance that are complicated, and environmental law is one of them, and climate change is one of them. So what this crew is going to find out is that just saying that you're going to do something is not the same as actually accomplishing it. And as they reveal more and more who they are and what they want and what they are going to try to do, the resistance against them is stiffening exponentially. And we've already seen huge demonstrations against this administration. I think we're going to see some of the biggest, even much bigger demonstrations, even much more citizen activity than maybe we've ever seen in this country.
Rallies were held around the country today to protest the president's climate policy.
The biggest march was in the nation's capital. Ashley Coram has more from Washington.
Thousands of people descended on the nation's capital, braving the sweltering heat to march with the People's Climate Movement.
Let's get out there, let's raise our voices, and let's send a message to Washington. This is about our planet, our future, and humankind.
Demonstrators hit the pavement from the Capitol building to the White House, protesting President Trump's climate policy.
It is shameful that the president who comes from New York could deny that climate change is an environmental issue.
It is not by any means a done deal because these guys have gotten into power that they're going to be able to stop this revolution from happening. In fact, some people suggest that this might be just the stimulus that we need for people to really rise up and demand that we make this change. So it's going to be a really interesting few years here.
Have you debated deniers?
Oh yes, I love debating deniers. It's harder and harder to find anybody to debate with. That was one of the things I did early on, actually. I debated a rather well-known denier down at Michigan State. That was kind of a little bit of a watershed for me because I thought that I kind of knew, but I thought I knew what I needed to know, but just because you're right and because you've got the facts isn't the same as doing well on a debate. What I do now is I give a lot of presentations around the state, and I always hope there's going to be that guy in the audience that will give me a little pushback, you know, and sometimes it happens. And it's hard to get angry at just the average people who've just been misled. You know, they've just been watching too much Fox News.
I think that's probably all true, but you would not be overwhelmed by pine bark beetles as it is because of climate change. That's how
so
the
much
world
of
would
this
be
you
different
don't
if it
know.
weren't for humans.
You pretend that you know, but you don't know, and you
gotta
believe
disagree
people
with you,
who
sir.
ask you
I really
questions.
have to disagree with you. I spent a lot of time with this topic.
I'm open-minded. You are not.
You know, you don't even know where to begin with some of these folks, and you don't want to be mean to them. But when you've got somebody who is a professional climate change denier that's smart enough to know better, I don't have much sympathy for those folks. I certainly welcome any opportunity to interact. I'll pay for the room.
So that's an open invitation?
That's an open invitation. That's an invitation.
Before we get back into my conversation with Peter, I first need to thank everyone out there who's given me encouragement, feedback, and support as I've been developing the Belief Books idea. From my wonderful wife, to my friends, to family and colleagues, and to the super nice and helpful podcasting community that completely caught me off guard. I hope that I can express my thanks and give back with the work I do for this series. It's pretty cool. From direct feedback to comments on tweets to emails, I've already been getting feedback on this project and my ideas, which I think is great. I hope to get more feedback and questions and comments as I keep posting more episodes. For this first episode, I thought I'd read one of those messages I got early on. It's an email from Tristan Matthews, who had originally found me on Twitter. Here's what he had to say. I thought it's worth sharing. Hi Josh, I'm extremely excited for your first episode of Climate Change Denial. As someone who has studied climatology and impact assessment, having a discussion with climate deniers, some of which exist in my family, aggravates me to no end. Talking to climate, quote, skeptics, unquote, leaves room for intellectual discussions on how the problem has evolved, the dangers that will and can arise if nothing is done, and what has been and could be done by countries individually in order to ensure we might mitigate/adapt appropriately. Deniers, however, are motivated by unsubstantiated claims and assume that everything is one big conspiracy, like the flat earth theory, something I've been hearing more and more these days. And let us not forget the cherry picking of climatological data to shut down all claims of a changing climate. There is, of course, a psychological factor about climate change. While it may be happening quickly in timescales relevant to climate as a whole, it is not immediate. Because it won't destroy the economy tomorrow or impact everyone's life all at once, deniers don't see it as an issue. To them, it is about the short term rather than the long term. Or deniers may say that because global temperature has been higher in the past, millions of years ago, that higher temperatures in the future will have a negative impact today. They fail to take into account that life, geology, and water and air currents on Earth were significantly different millions of years ago. It's apples versus oranges. I better stop now. I can rant about this topic all day and night. I'm eager to hear how you lay out the story of climate change denial, and will keep my eyes open for episode 1. Regards, Tristan. In a follow-up email, Tristan mentioned that he was interested in talking more about this topic. So, Tristan, if you're listening, if you haven't already gotten an email from me, expect an email from me soon so I can get you on the podcast to talk. Thank you for your message and your early support.
Pretend I'm someone who denies that the climate is changing. What would you say to me? What are, for people to go out and have mini debates or have these discussions, what are some things that you could, because you obviously can't change someone's mind usually right there in the moment, but plant a seed here and there, what would you say?
I guess I would just say, this is the overwhelming finding of the science community that has been debated in tremendous detail and studied for 150 years. And we are as certain of this science as we are that cigarettes are bad for you, that HIV causes AIDS, that the earth revolves around the sun. This is not some kind of theoretical, airy-fairy, cutting-edge science. This is based on Physics 101, first-order physics that we have understood and known for, in some cases, 150 or 200 years. So to prove that climate change is wrong, you basically would have to throw out all the chemistry and all the physics books that we have and start over. If you've got some kind of explanation for how we get all of the observations that we have, thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of observations, in the absence of a warming planet and in the absence of a planet that is being warmed by human emissions, then Nobel Prizes, unlimited funding, and endowed chair at a university are all yours. So have at it, publish that. That would be an enormous motivation for any scientist to become more famous than Einstein or Newton if they could overturn this. And the fact is that the science only gets stronger and more detailed, and we continue to observe it playing out right in front of us.
Yeah, but the beauty of science is just that when do you ever hear someone on the other side of the aisle saying, prove me wrong, right? Please go out and let's, I'd be happy to be proved wrong. It's that beauty of science, a humbling thing. And it's just a complete opposite mindset on that side.
Right.
If I want to do something about it, I'm not a scientist and I have a full-time job or whatever, what can I do?
When people used to ask me that question, they still do, but it used to be my answer was change the light bulb, eat less meat, drive less, all this kind of no-brainer stuff. But, really for an individual, my answer now is tell somebody. Tell somebody that you're concerned about this. This is happening. All the best scientists in the world are telling us it's happening. We're observing it right in front of us. And you are concerned about what happens to your children and your grandchildren. What happens to the next 10,000 generations of human beings? What happens to all the other species that we share this planet with? We are in danger of degrading the life support system of the only planet that we know of in the universe that supports complex life. This is a big deal. And we're only going to get one shot at this, and that shot is happening right now. what the polls are telling us is that people don't talk about climate change, and they don't talk about it because they think their concern makes them in the minority. But in fact, the majority of people are concerned about the issue, and they want to talk about it, they want to learn more, but they don't know where to go, they don't know who to trust, and they fear that they will be singled out, or perhaps get opposition if they bring it up, or they'll make people uncomfortable. So tell somebody. That's my number one advice.
I think that's great advice, and here we are, hopefully able to tell some more people. Thank you again. I would like to talk for hours more, but hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tell someone. It's a simple, but I think really practical and effective piece of advice. I guess I'm starting to do my part by making this episode and telling you, so I guess that makes it your turn. Thank you for inviting me over and meeting with me, Peter, and thanks for all the good work you do on such an important issue. You can check out Peter's work on the Dark Snow Project and his Climate Crock of the Week series for even more information on climate change and these climate crocs that clearly need to be dealt with, and dealt with soon. Visit thebeliefbooks.com for more information, links, and resources all related to this episode, even a full transcription. And send me a message from the contact page if you're a climate change denier or you know someone who is and want me to set up a debate. So, thanks a lot for listening to the very first episode of Chapter 1 of The Belief Books. There's so much more to cover when it comes to climate change and denial, but I'll save it for the next episode of Chapter 1. There's a lot more to come on that topic. You'll be able to listen to those conversations for this chapter and other chapters on thebeliefbooks.com, or you can find me on Podbean or iTunes. And if you like this thing I'm doing, you can support me for as little as $1 per month on Podbean's patron program at thebeliefbooks.podbean.com. Just to give you an idea of what that all is, those of you who decide to help with your $1 per month would become official listeners of the Belief Books. With that, you'll get access to behind the scenes and extra footage of this production, as well as a free ebook for every release every year. You can give $5 per month and become an official reader of the Belief Books, and for that, I will send you a real-life, physical, printed copy of the book each year. So for your support, you'll hopefully end up with a volume of designed books that document this series. If you can and want to support with more, for $10 per month, you can become a publisher of the Belief Books, which gets you into the printed books. Your name would be on the inside cover of each book as a publisher. You can find more information about how that works and what you get at thebeliefbooks.podbean.com or just on thebeliefbooks.com. It's pretty simple, but it could go a long way in helping me do this more and do it better. Please contact me on Facebook, Twitter, or directly at thebeliefbooks.com, where you can comment on this episode and discuss anything that came up. Feel free to leave a review on iTunes if you use that. I'd love to hear your feedback, suggestions, and ideas on how I can improve this show. I'm all ears. And if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, email me at beliefbooks@gmail.com. I'll see you on the next episode of The Belief Books.